My daughter texted, "Dad, you will be hosting Christmas for 70 people at the lake house. We have already told everyone." I replied, "Then you will need a caterer. I will be at the cabin until the 25th. The next morning, my son-in-law called screaming. That is because I had shut off all utilities and changed the security codes before leaving. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. My name is George Bennett. I am 67 years old, and I spent the last 3 decades building a life I thought my family would cherish. I was on my hands and knees. The harsh chemical smell of carpet cleaner burned my nostrils. I scrubbed furiously at a massive dark red wine stain bleeding into the center of the living room rug. The lake house was supposed to be quiet on a Tuesday morning. Instead, it looked like the aftermath of a riot. Empty beer bottles lined the mahogany mantelpiece my late wife Mary and I had restored by hand. Muddy boot tracks stretched across the hardwood floors. Trent, my son-in-law, had asked to use the property for a quiet weekend retreat with 2 business partners. I trusted him. I gave him the keys to my sanctuary. He repaid that trust by throwing a raucous corporate party, trashing the place, and leaving without a single word of apology. The physical exertion of scrubbing sent a sharp, unmistakable spike of pain straight through my chest. I dropped the brush, clutching my shirt. My breath caught in my throat. It was the exact same agonizing pressure I felt last year before the ambulance took me away. The quadruple bypass surgery was supposed to be a wake-up call for my family. It was a wake-up call for me instead. As I sat there on the ruined carpet waiting for my heart rate to stabilize, the memory of my hospital discharge hit me with brutal clarity. I sat in a wheelchair by the automatic doors, wearing a flimsy hospital gown, holding a plastic bag with my medications. I called Amanda. I needed my daughter to take me home. She answered the phone with background music playing. She told me she could not leave her spa weekend in Sedona because she had already paid for a deep tissue mud wrap. She told me to call a cab. I took a taxi home alone with a freshly stitched chest. That was the day I realized I was no longer a father to her. I was an inconvenience. I pulled my phone from my pocket. It was an email notification. Trent had forwarded an invoice to my inbox. The subject line read, "Lake House Cleaning Bill." I opened the document. It was a charge for $800 from a local professional cleaning service. Trent had not hired anyone. He had generated an invoice and forwarded it to me, expecting me to pay for the desecration of my own home. He wanted me to foot the bill for a mess he created. He saw me as a bottomless bank account. He saw me as a free hotel manager. The sheer audacity of his entitlement eradicated any lingering affection I had for the man. Trent owed me $50,000 from a business loan I gave him 3 years ago to start his consulting firm. He never paid back a single cent. He drove a luxury car, wore custom suits, and took my daughter on expensive vacations, all while ignoring his immense financial debt to me. Another notification flashed across my screen. A text message from Amanda. There was no greeting. There was no inquiry about how I was feeling or if the lake house was in good condition. The message was a direct, absolute mandate. Dad, Trent's firm is restructuring. He needs to impress the senior partners. You will be hosting Christmas for 70 people at the lake house on the 24th. We have already told everyone. Make sure the driveway is cleared for valet parking. We need you to handle the catering and the bar setup. Trent's promotion depends on this being flawless. I read the words again. I read them until the letters blurred together. 70 elite strangers walking through my home. 70 arrogant corporate executives tracking snow and entitlement across the floors Mary and I laid together. Amanda did not ask if I was up to the physical labor. She did not ask if I wanted to host a massive event in the home where I was supposed to be mourning and healing. She issued an order. She expected her 67-year-old father with a compromised heart to serve hors d'oeuvres to her husband's wealthy colleagues. She expected me to organize, and execute a corporate gala so Trent could secure a promotion he did not deserve. I looked around the silent house. Mary and I spent 5 years building this place on weekends. We painted these walls. We chose every piece of furniture. We dreamed of a house filled with grandchildren sitting by the fireplace, drinking hot cocoa, laughing on Christmas morning. That dream died the day Mary passed away. Amanda never brought her life here. She only brought her demands. The lake house was no longer a home to them. It was a free venue. It was a status symbol they could parade in front of their pretentious friends to fake a level of wealth they did not actually possess. They were drowning in debt, living a lifestyle funded entirely by my silent subsidies and uncollected loans. I did not scream. I did not throw the phone against the wall. A strange glacial calm washed over me. The throbbing in my chest subsided, replaced by an ironclad determination. For years, I kept quiet to keep the peace. I swallowed the disrespect because I wanted to hold on to the illusion of a family. I realized that keeping the peace meant sacrificing my own dignity. I was enabling their monstrous behavior by refusing to enforce boundaries. I picked up my phone. I did not write an emotional paragraph. I did not beg for respect. I responded with the cold, absolute truth of my new reality. Then you will need a caterer. I will be at the cabin until the 25th. I pressed send. I turned off the screen. I stood up from the stained carpet. I walked directly to the master bedroom and pulled a single duffel bag from the closet. The era of the subservient father was officially over. The silent adjustment had begun. I stared at the illuminated screen of my phone. The blue text bubble from Amanda hung there like a physical weight in the dimly lit living room. 70 people. A corporate gala disguised as a family Christmas. The sheer audacity of her demand neutralized any lingering guilt I might have harbored about setting a boundary. I felt no urge to accommodate my daughter. I felt nothing but a cold and absolute clarity. The lake house was mine. The quiet was mine. The right to grieve my wife in peace was mine. I tapped the screen. My fingers moved steadily across the digital keyboard. I did not draft a long explanation. I did not remind her of my recent quadruple bypass surgery or the heavy prescription medication I took every morning to keep my heart beating. I refused to offer medical excuses to a daughter who viewed my physical limitations as an inconvenient obstacle to her social calendar. I simply typed the unvarnished truth. I wrote that she would need to hire a professional caterer. I informed her that I was driving up to the hunting cabin in the mountains and would not return to the lake house until the 25th of December. I pressed send. I placed the phone face up on the glass coffee table and waited for the inevitable explosion. The reaction was instantaneous. The phone vibrated violently against the glass. The screen lit up with a rapid barrage of incoming messages. Amanda did not ask if I was feeling unwell. She did not ask why I was abruptly retreating to the isolated cabin in the dead of winter. She attacked. Her first message accused me of being impossibly selfish. Her second message claimed I was deliberately trying to sabotage Trent and his career. She wrote that I had always been jealous of his corporate success. I read the words with a bitter taste in my mouth. Jealous. She accused me of being jealous of a man who financed his luxury lifestyle with my uncollected $50,000 loan. Trent drove a pristine German sports car and wore tailored Italian suits while actively ignoring the massive debt he owed his father-in-law. The irony was suffocating. Amanda typed that Mary would be ashamed of me for ruining a family holiday. That was her favorite weapon. She used her dead mother as a tool for emotional extortion. She knew exactly which buttons to push to inflict maximum psychological damage. For years, that specific tactic worked perfectly. It made me bend to her will. It made me apologize for things I had not done just to keep the peace. Today, it only cemented my resolve. I watched the text bubbles multiply rapidly on the screen. She demanded I cancel the cabin trip immediately. She ordered me to start prepping the guest rooms and arranging the valet parking schedule for her guests. She told me to stop acting like a petulant child. I did not touch the phone. I let the screen go dark. A moment later, the phone began to ring. The caller ID flashed Trent's name in bold letters. I let it ring. The shrill sound echoed off the high vaulted ceilings of the lake house. It rang until the automated system sent it to voicemail. A minute passed in heavy silence. Then the notification chime signaled a new audio message. I tapped the icon and put the phone on speaker. Trent's voice shattered the quiet of the room. He was not asking for a favor. He was shouting. The audio clipped as he screamed into the receiver. He called me a bitter old man. He stated that he had already promised his senior partners an exclusive lakeside retreat, and I was making him look like an incompetent fool. He demanded I stay and fulfill my obligations as a host. He yelled that he had highly influential investors flying in from Chicago and New York who expected a fully catered premium experience. Then came the ultimate threat. Trent lowered his voice to a vicious, calculating growl. He explicitly stated that if I ruined this corporate event, I would be permanently cut out of their lives. He threatened to completely ban me from ever meeting my future grandchildren. He said I would die alone in this empty house because absolutely no one would want to visit a useless and selfish father. He ended the call by ordering me to have the driveway plowed and the walkway salted by tomorrow morning. The voicemail ended. The automated voice informed me the message was saved. I sat in the leather armchair and listened to the absolute quiet of the lake house. Trent thought the threat of isolation would break me. He thought the idea of losing my future grandchildren would force me into immediate submission. He did not understand that his threat was actually a liberation. They had already abandoned me. They had already isolated me. They only kept me around to extract my resources and manage their properties for free. There was nothing left to salvage in this relationship. I stood up from the armchair. I did not type a furious reply to Amanda. I did not call Trent back to demand respect. Arguing with them would only validate their delusion that my boundaries were negotiable. I simply turned my back on the living room and walked down the hallway to the master bedroom. I opened the heavy wooden closet doors. I reached up to the top shelf and pulled down a faded green canvas duffel bag. It was the same bag I used for weekend hunting trips before my heart gave out. I packed 3 heavy flannel shirts, 2 pairs of denim trousers, thick wool socks, and my prescription medication. I zipped the bag shut. The sound was loud and final in the empty room. I slung the canvas strap over my shoulder. I walked out of the bedroom without looking back. The time for talking had passed. The time for silent, devastating action had arrived. I stood in the center of the living room with my heavy canvas duffel bag slung over my shoulder. The profound quiet of the lake house pressed heavily against my ears. I pulled my smartphone from the deep pocket of my winter coat. I unlocked the screen and opened the Master Home Security application. Trent had vehemently insisted on installing this state-of-the-art system 2 years ago. He claimed it was entirely for my safety. He told me that an aging man living alone with a compromised heart condition required 24-hour monitoring. I knew the absolute truth now. Trent installed the system solely so he could control the property remotely. He used the application to unlock the doors for his arrogant friends when I was away at medical appointments. He used it to adjust the ambient lighting and play loud music for his impromptu weekend parties. He viewed this sacred house as his personal corporate retreat. I stared at the digital dashboard illuminating my face in the dark room. The power dynamic ended right here. I navigated to the master administrative settings. I selected the user access portal. Trent had his own customized administrative profile. Amanda had one too. I selected my daughter's name and hit the delete command. I watched her digital profile vanish from the screen. I felt a profound, heavy sense of finality wash over me. I deleted my son-in-law next. I permanently revoked all guest passes and temporary access codes he had generated. I changed the master security code from the year Amanda was born to a completely random string of complex numbers. I memorized the new sequence instantly. I activated the perimeter sensors and the exterior camera feeds. If anyone tried to punch in the old access codes, the digital keypad would simply flash red and deny them entry. The house was no longer theirs to exploit. They were officially locked out of the venue they had promised to 70 wealthy people. I swiped across the illuminated glass of my phone to the climate control panel. The current interior temperature rested at a highly comfortable 72 degrees. Amanda fully expected her 70 elite guests to walk into a warm, inviting atmosphere tomorrow evening. She expected them to shed their expensive, tailored winter coats and drink vintage champagne in a perfectly climate-controlled environment. She expected the ambient warmth of my home to facilitate her husband's lucrative business deals and secure his unearned promotion. I placed my finger on the digital slider. I completely bypassed the standard energy-saving mode. I pushed the temperature requirement drastically down to 40 degrees. This was the absolute minimum setting allowed by the software before the system would trigger a freeze warning. I heard the low, steady hum of the massive central heating unit power down instantly in the utility closet down the hall. The sudden, heavy silence was absolute. The large mahogany air vents ceased blowing warm air into the sprawling living room. The bitter winter chill from the frozen lake outside immediately began to seep through the large pane windows. I stood completely still and felt the temperature drop rapidly. The freezing air stung my cheeks. I welcomed the bitter chill. The freezing temperature mirrored the exact emotional state of my heart. I was no longer providing warmth and comfort to people who viewed my existence as a burdensome utility. I zipped my heavy winter coat up to my chin. The massive stone fireplace sat cold and empty. I refused to leave a single log of dry firewood indoors. I had moved the entire stack to the locked exterior shed earlier that afternoon. If Trent somehow managed to breach the heavy oak doors, he and his 70 corporate investors would find themselves standing in a massive, elegant icebox. I adjusted the thick canvas strap of my duffel bag across my chest. I turned away from the freezing living room and walked down the main hallway toward the basement door. My heavy boots thudded loudly against the polished hardwood floor. I opened the door and flipped the wall switch. The harsh fluorescent bulbs flickered to life, casting long shadows down the wooden staircase. I descended the stairs slowly. My knees ached slightly in the cold, damp air of the underground level. I reached the solid concrete floor and walked past the neat rows of metal storage shelves. I stopped directly in front of the main utility grid. Mary and I had meticulously planned this plumbing infrastructure 30 years ago. We laid the copper pipes ourselves to save money. We built this solid foundation with our own calloused hands and aching backs. Amanda never knew the blisters and the physical exhaustion it took to run fresh, clean water into this property. She only knew how to turn on the shiny brass faucets and demand absolute perfection. I located the main water shutoff valve. It was a heavy industrial red iron wheel covered in a thin layer of basement dust. I gripped the cold iron firmly with both hands. I braced my boots against the concrete floor for leverage. The valve was incredibly stiff from years of inactivity. I channeled every ounce of my frustration into my grip. I pulled downward with all my physical strength. The intense physical strain caused a sharp, dangerous twinge deep within my healing chest. I ignored the pain entirely. I twisted the heavy red wheel until it groaned and locked firmly into place. The faint, continuous rushing sound of water moving through the copper pipes ceased completely. I severed the vital lifeblood of the house. I cut off the water supply to the expansive kitchen where Amanda expected professional caterers to prepare elaborate meals. I disabled the luxurious guest bathrooms her wealthy investors would desperately need to use. I rendered the entire plumbing network completely useless. I walked over to the utility sink and opened the lowest faucet to drain the remaining water from the lines. I watched the clear water flow down the drain until the pipes were completely empty. I knew the freezing interior temperatures would not burst the dry pipes now. The house was safe from structural damage but absolutely uninhabitable for guests. Without running water, hosting a corporate gala for 70 people was a physical impossibility. Trent would face an unmitigated disaster. I released the brass faucet and wiped my dusty hands on my denim trousers. I took a deep breath of the frigid basement air. My heart pounded a steady, triumphant rhythm against my ribcage. I turned off the fluorescent lights and walked back up the wooden stairs in total darkness. I stepped back into the main hallway. The ambient temperature of the house had already plummeted significantly. I could vividly see my own breath forming small white clouds in the dim light of the entryway. I walked to the heavy oak front door. I stepped out onto the freezing front porch. The icy winter wind whipped violently across my face. I pulled the heavy oak door shut behind me. I inserted my brass key into the reinforced deadbolt. I turned the key until I heard the solid, heavy metallic click of the locking mechanism sliding deep into the steel frame. I aggressively tested the brass handle. The door was absolutely immovable. I walked down the snow-covered concrete steps toward my heavy-duty pickup truck. The frozen gravel crunched loudly beneath my heavy winter boots. I tossed my canvas duffel bag onto the passenger seat. I climbed into the driver's seat and started the engine. The powerful motor roared to life, shattering the peaceful quiet of the isolated lakeside neighborhood. I turned the heater on full blast and gripped the freezing steering wheel. I shifted the heavy truck into drive and pulled away from the property. I watched my beloved home fade into the rearview mirror. The sprawling lake house sat completely dark against the snowy, barren landscape. There were no welcoming lights shining from the large windows. There was no warm smoke rising from the stone chimney. It looked exactly like what I had engineered it to be: a dark, impenetrable fortress. I turned my truck onto the main highway heading toward the mountains. The asphalt road was incredibly slick with dangerous black ice, but I drove with unwavering confidence. The truck heater blasted warm air across my frozen hands. The profound isolation of the mountain cabin waited for me 30 miles up the treacherous, winding road. I felt no guilt whatsoever. I felt no remorse for the absolute chaos I was leaving behind for my daughter and her husband. They demanded a free venue. They demanded a silent servant. I gave them a locked icebox and a spectacular logistical nightmare instead. I thought about the $50,000 business loan Trent had begged me for 3 years ago. He promised on his honor to repay every single cent within 12 months. He used my money to lease a premium office space and buy expensive tailored suits. He built his entire professional image on my stolen retirement funds. Now he was attempting to use my home to secure a promotion he lacked the actual talent to earn. I pressed my heavy boot down on the accelerator. The dark pine trees blurred past my windows in the freezing night. The absolute darkness swallowed my truck as I drove higher into the freezing elevation. The falling snow began to blanket the highway, covering my tire tracks completely. Tomorrow morning, Trent would arrive at the lake house with his catering delivery trucks and his monumental arrogance. Tomorrow morning, he would punch his memorized access code into the digital keypad and receive a glowing red denial. Tomorrow morning, he would discover that the man he treated as a disposable utility had completely destroyed his fragile corporate facade. I smiled into the empty, quiet cabin of my truck. The war had officially begun, and I held all the keys. I woke up to the sharp snap and hiss of dry pine logs burning in the cast-iron stove. The mountain cabin was small, built entirely of rough-hewn cedar and filled with the rich scent of wood smoke and old leather. I lay still under a thick wool blanket for a long time. The heavy, oppressive tightness in my chest that had plagued me yesterday was completely gone. My heart beat with a slow, steady rhythm. The freezing winter wind howled against the reinforced window panes, but inside the air was deeply warm and incredibly still. I pushed myself out of bed and walked across the woven rug to the small kitchenette. I filled the battered aluminum percolator with water and set it on the stove. This cabin was my sanctuary. I purchased this single acre of mountain property 2 decades ago. Trent always despised this place. He called it a primitive shack. He refused to drive his expensive cars up the unpaved mountain road. He preferred the sprawling luxury of the lake house, a property he contributed absolutely nothing to build. I poured a cup of dark, bitter coffee and walked over to the wooden dining table. The digital clock on the microwave read 8 in the morning. Down in the valley, the sun was likely reflecting off the frozen surface of the lake. I took a slow sip of the scalding coffee. I knew exactly what was happening 30 miles away. I visualized the icy driveway, the frozen patio, and the heavy oak doors firmly sealed shut. The peace inside my cabin was absolute, but I knew it was finite. I was waiting for the inevitable shockwave. The silence shattered instantly. My cell phone, resting face down on the scarred wooden table, began to vibrate violently. The harsh buzzing sound rattled against the timber. It was a relentless, aggressive, mechanical noise. I did not reach for it immediately. I sat in my wooden chair, wrapped my hands around the warm ceramic mug, and watched the phone dance across the tabletop. The caller ID flashed brightly in the dim cabin light. Trent. The call disconnected after 6 rings. 10 seconds later, the phone erupted again. He was calling back with frantic urgency. The repeated calls were not a plea for help. They were a demand for immediate compliance. I let it ring a 3rd time. I wanted him to stand in the freezing cold and experience the agonizing panic of losing control. I wanted him to feel the exact same helplessness Amanda inflicted upon me when she abandoned me at the hospital doors. On the 4th consecutive attempt, I reached out and picked up the device. I pressed the green button to accept the call. I brought the speaker to my ear. I did not say hello. Trent did not wait for a greeting. His voice exploded through the tiny speaker with volcanic force. He was not just angry, he was completely unhinged. The sound of his frantic breathing and the harsh winter wind whistling in the background painted a vivid picture of his desperation. He screamed that he was standing on the front porch of the lake house. He yelled that he had a massive commercial delivery truck idling in my driveway. He had paid a premium holiday fee to have 70 heavy folding tables, hundreds of crystal champagne flutes, and a mountain of decorative floral arrangements delivered bright and early. He screamed that 4 union delivery workers were standing in the freezing snow, waiting for him to open the front door. Trent demanded to know what was wrong with the security system. He shouted that he had punched his personal access code into the digital keypad 7 times. He said the screen kept flashing a hostile red light and emitting a loud error tone. He assumed it was a catastrophic software failure. He ordered me to open my security application and remotely unlock the deadbolt. He yelled that the delivery drivers were threatening to leave the cargo on the icy driveway and charge him a massive penalty fee for the delay. He told me I was wasting his highly valuable time. I remained perfectly silent. I took another slow sip of my black coffee. I let the bitter liquid warm my throat. I listened to his frantic demands echo through the quiet cabin. His entire reality was fracturing, and he still believed he possessed the authority to issue orders. When I did not immediately respond, Trent's tone shifted from frustration to sheer panic. He realized this was not a technological glitch. He realized I was listening to him. He screamed my name. He demanded to know if I had changed the master codes. The sheer disbelief in his voice was palpable. He asked how I could possibly do something so incredibly spiteful on the morning of his most important corporate event. He reminded me that he had senior managing partners flying in from across the country. He yelled that his entire promotion, his massive year-end bonus, and his professional reputation hinged on this holiday gala. He screamed that I was actively destroying his future over a petty family disagreement. His outrage was fascinating to witness. Trent genuinely believed that my house, my property, and my resources belonged to him by right of marriage. He believed that $50,000 of my stolen retirement funds was simply his due. He believed that kicking me out of my own home so he could impress his arrogant colleagues was standard operating procedure. He lacked any fundamental understanding of personal boundaries. Trent demanded the new access password. He did not ask. He commanded. He told me to stop playing games and give him the 6-digit number immediately. He swore that if I gave him the code, he would overlook my insubordination. He promised he would not tell Amanda about my vindictive behavior. He actually tried to frame his demand as a generous concession. He told me that if the delivery trucks left, he would lose thousands of dollars in non-refundable deposits. He screamed that he was freezing to death on my porch, and the caterers were scheduled to arrive in exactly 2 hours. I lowered the coffee mug to the table. I felt no surge of adrenaline. I felt no residual fear of his booming voice. The man screaming through the phone was not a powerful corporate executive. He was a desperate, entitled fraud, realizing his safety net had vanished. I finally spoke. My voice was low, steady, and entirely devoid of emotion. I did not match his frantic energy. I told him he was standing on private property. I told him he did not possess a lease agreement, a key, or any legal permission to occupy the premises. I spoke with the clinical detachment of a stranger. I informed him that the security codes had been permanently revoked. Trent gasped for air. He stammered, unable to process the absolute finality in my tone. He tried to interrupt me, but I cut him off. I told him to instruct his delivery drivers to turn their trucks around. I told him to cancel the caterers. I clearly stated that if he attempted to bypass the locks or force entry into the building, the automated security system would instantly dispatch the local police department. I reminded him that breaking into a secured residence is a felony offense. Trent shrieked. He completely lost his composure. He threatened to drive up to the mountain cabin and drag me back down to the lake house by force. He threatened to call Amanda and have her legally declare me mentally incompetent. He screamed every vile, venomous insult he could summon. He called me a pathetic, lonely old man who was going to die completely isolated from his only family. I let him finish his tirade. I let the echoes of his vicious threats die down in the quiet cabin. I looked out the frost-covered window at the heavy snow falling over the silent pine trees. I had spent years desperately trying to hold on to the fragment of a family that did not exist. I had sacrificed my money, my home, and my dignity to appease a daughter who viewed me as an ATM and a son-in-law who viewed me as a servant. That era was dead. I pressed the red button on the screen. I ended the call mid-sentence. The connection severed instantly. Trent's screaming vanished. The beautiful, profound silence of the mountain cabin rushed back in to fill the room. I set the phone face down on the wooden table. I did not turn it off. I wanted the battery to remain active so the device could receive the inevitable flood of panicked text messages. I wanted a digital record of their escalating desperation. I leaned back in my wooden chair and watched the fire burn in the stove. The lines of war were officially drawn. I had not just locked a door. I had dismantled the entire foundation of their parasitic lifestyle. Trent was currently standing in the freezing snow, surrounded by hired workers he could not utilize, staring at a fortress he could not breach. His corporate facade was actively collapsing in the driveway of my home. I took a deep breath. My chest felt completely clear. The heavy burden of compliance was gone. I picked up my coffee mug and took another drink. The day was just beginning. Trent's threats about declaring me mentally incompetent echoed in my mind. It was a predictable tactic. Kicking a parasite out of its host always triggers a violent survival response. Amanda and Trent possessed a terrifyingly skewed perception of reality. They truly believed that because I was elderly and grieving, I was legally defenseless. They assumed my refusal to serve them was a symptom of cognitive decline rather than an assertion of personal respect. They did not realize that I had spent the last 5 years meticulously documenting every financial transaction, every unpaid loan, and every aggressive demand they made. I had kept receipts. I had kept bank statements detailing the $50,000 transferred to Trent's corporate account. I was completely lucid, and I was armed with an irrefutable paper trail. The freezing temperature inside the lake house would currently be chilling Trent to his core. The irony was exquisite. He had planned to use the ambient warmth of my home to toast his own success. Now he was shivering in a designer topcoat, watching his professional reputation freeze to death on my front porch. He could not call the authorities to force entry because he had absolutely no legal standing. He could not break a window without triggering a massive siren and an immediate police response. He was entirely paralyzed by his own arrogance. I stood up from the table and walked over to the cabin window. The snow was falling thicker now, covering the rugged mountain landscape in a heavy white blanket. The cold glass felt soothing against my fingertips. I had spent decades building wealth, maintaining properties, and providing a safety net for my family. I had allowed my love for my late wife to blind me to the reality of what our daughter had become. Mary would have been devastated to see Amanda's callous behavior, but Mary would have never tolerated this level of disrespect. Mary was a woman of fierce principles. She would have locked the doors years ago. I was finally doing what I should have done the moment Amanda refused to pick me up from the cardiac ward. I was severing the financial and emotional umbilical cord. I watched the snow accumulate on the branches of the ancient cedar trees outside. The mountain was quiet, strong, and completely unbothered by the chaos unfolding in the valley below. I felt a profound sense of kinship with the isolated landscape. I had reclaimed my territory. The phone on the table lit up again, buzzing silently against the wood. Amanda's name flashed across the screen. The secondary assault had begun. I did not move toward the table. I simply watched the screen illuminate the dark corner of the room, completely indifferent to their panic. The fortress was secure. The parasite was locked out. The silence in my cabin remained absolute. I turned away from the phone and threw another heavy pine log into the burning stove. The flames roared higher, pushing back the winter chill. I was entirely ready for whatever they attempted next. The profound silence of the mountain cabin was broken by a sharp mechanical vibration against the rough timber of the dining table. George Bennett lowered his ceramic coffee mug and stared at the glowing screen of his smartphone. A high-priority security alert flashed across the digital display. The automated notification indicated a perimeter breach at the rear patio of the lake house. George picked up the device and tapped the notification icon. The high-definition live video feed materialized on the screen. It was early afternoon down in the valley. Heavy snow fell in thick sheets across the wooden deck George had built with his own hands 20 years ago. Trent paced aggressively back and forth across the frozen planks. He wore a tailored cashmere overcoat that offered absolutely no protection against the bitter winter wind. He rubbed his hands together and blew into his palms. His breath formed angry white clouds in the freezing air. He marched up to the secondary security keypad, mounted beside the sliding glass doors. He jammed his finger into the buttons with frantic, aggressive movements. The small light on the panel flashed a bright, hostile red. Access denied. Trent kicked the solid base of the wall in pure frustration. George sat in the absolute comfort of his heated cabin and watched the display with complete emotional detachment. He was observing a desperate man failing to infiltrate a locked fortress. Trent disappeared from the camera frame for several minutes. George did not close the application. He simply waited. Trent reappeared on the screen carrying a heavy steel crowbar. He had likely retrieved the heavy iron tool from the emergency kit inside his luxury sports car. He marched directly toward the floor to ceiling double-paned glass doors. These expansive windows offered a pristine, unobstructed view of the frozen lake. They were Mary's favorite feature of the entire property. They were also constructed from expensive tempered security glass. Trent did not hesitate or look around to see if anyone was watching. He gripped the heavy steel bar with both hands and swung it backward over his shoulder. He drove the iron tip directly into the center of the left glass pane with maximum violent force. The reinforced glass did not shatter immediately. It webbed into 1,000 intricate, jagged cracks. Trent yelled something unintelligible. The sensitive outdoor audio microphone picked up his breathless, heavy frustration. He swung the crowbar a second time. The tempered pane completely erupted. A massive shower of crystalline shards cascaded across the expensive, polished hardwood floor inside the living room. Trent reached his arm carefully through the jagged hole. He located the manual interior latch and flipped it upward. He grabbed the metal handle and dragged the ruined door open. The freezing winter wind immediately rushed into the house. Trent stepped over the broken glass and entered the property. He had officially committed breaking and entering. He was now a criminal trespassing in his father-in-law's home. George switched the video feed to the interior living room camera. Trent stood in the center of the room. He could see his own breath. He realized the house was completely dead. The ambient temperature was freezing. The water lines were entirely drained. The smart panels on the walls were completely locked down. Trent pulled his phone from his cashmere coat and made a frantic, desperate call. George watched the silent feed for another 40 minutes. A rusted, unmarked white utility van pulled into the snowy driveway. A man wearing a stained canvas work jacket stepped out of the vehicle carrying a massive leather tool bag. This was not a licensed municipal contractor. This was an unauthorized, under-the-table electrician Trent had hired in sheer panic. Trent met the man at the front door and led him straight down the hallway toward the basement stairs. George switched his screen to the subterranean utility room camera. He watched the stranger approach the highly sophisticated smart power matrix. The man did not attempt to connect a computer or reboot the software safely. He pulled a heavy pair of iron wire cutters from his leather belt. He physically ripped the digital control panel off the concrete wall. He began splicing the heavy copper wires together. He completely bypassed the expensive security motherboard George had paid thousands of dollars to install. Bright yellow sparks showered across the concrete floor. The basement lights flickered violently and hummed to life. The massive central heating unit groaned loudly as the forced manual bypass caused it to ignite. Trent chose to irreparably damage the property rather than cancel his corporate holiday party. The smartphone vibrated again in George's hand. The live video feed shrank to the upper corner of the screen. A new text message from Amanda appeared below the video. She did not express a single ounce of remorse. She did not apologize for her husband violently smashing his way into her father's private sanctuary. Her message was a breathtaking display of pure, unadulterated arrogance. She wrote that Trent had to break the patio door because the smart lock maliciously malfunctioned. She stated that the freezing temperature inside the house was completely unacceptable for her elite corporate guests. Then she delivered the ultimate insult. She demanded that George immediately transfer $2,000 to her checking account to cover the cost of an emergency glass repair service. She claimed he was financially responsible for the damages because his faulty security system forced Trent to take extreme physical measures. She expected her father to finance the repair of a window her husband intentionally and criminally destroyed with a crowbar. George stared at the demanding text message. He did not feel a sudden spike of anger. He felt absolute icy clarity. He looked back at the live video feed. Trent was pacing in the living room and barking orders at the unlicensed contractor. Trent felt entirely entitled to destroy George's property. This staggering level of entitlement did not materialize overnight. It was carefully cultivated over years of unpunished financial parasitism. 3 years ago, Trent sat in that exact same living room and wept openly. He claimed his boutique consulting firm was on the verge of total catastrophic bankruptcy. He begged George for a $50,000 business loan to keep his doors open. He swore on his personal honor that he would repay the massive debt with interest within exactly 12 months. George transferred the money from his retirement savings the very next morning to protect his daughter's future. Trent used those specific funds to lease a premium corner office downtown and purchase custom-tailored Italian suits. 36 months passed without a single payment. Trent never paid back a solitary dime. He bought Amanda a diamond anniversary band. He financed a new luxury sports car. He took expensive vacations to tropical resorts. He lived like a self-made millionaire while actively ignoring the monumental debt he owed the man who saved his career. George never pressed the issue because he wanted to keep the peace. Now, watching Trent command a black market contractor to tear apart the electrical grid, George understood the fatal error of his silence. His generosity was never viewed as a lifeline. It was viewed as an endless, exploitable resource. Amanda expected him to pay for the broken window because she had been conditioned to believe her father existed solely to absorb their financial collateral damage. George locked the phone screen. He stood up from the wooden table and watched the fire burn in the stove. He would not transfer the $2,000. He would not call the local police to report the violent break-in. He would let them decorate the frozen house. He would let them prepare for their elite gala. He would counter their criminal intrusion with a silent, devastating legal strike they would never see coming. I locked the screen of my smartphone and placed the device flat against the heavy wooden table. The fire in the cast-iron stove crackled loudly. It threw warm orange light across the rustic cabin walls. Down in the valley, Trent was currently commanding a black market electrician to butcher my property. A normal man would dial the authorities immediately. A normal man would dispatch a squad car to the lake house, press trespassing charges, and let the local justice system handle his arrogant son-in-law. I was not a normal man, and I was entirely done playing by conventional rules. The police would arrive with their sirens blaring. Trent would lie. He would use his expensive tailored suit and his polished corporate vocabulary to charm the responding officers. He would claim it was a simple family misunderstanding. He would say his elderly father-in-law was confused and had accidentally locked him out right before a massive holiday event. The police would likely tell us to sort it out in civil court. Trent would receive a minor citation. He would pay a negligible fine, and he would still host his corporate gala in my home. He would win. I refused to let him win. I refused to let Amanda continue viewing my life as her personal collateral. I needed a solution that offered absolute irreversible destruction of their entitlement. I picked up my phone again. I completely ignored the local police dispatch number. I scrolled through my encrypted contact list. I found the name I needed. I pressed the call button and listened to the steady ringing tone. Oliver Stanton answered on the second ring. Oliver was not just an attorney. He was a legal predator dressed in imported wool. We met 40 years ago during a brutal corporate acquisition battle. We fought on the same side. I learned very quickly that Oliver did not practice law to negotiate fair settlements. He practiced law to completely obliterate his opposition. He was my oldest friend, the executor of my estate, and the single most ruthless man I knew. His voice came through the speaker sharp and entirely alert despite the early hour. He asked me what was wrong. He knew I rarely called him on a weekend unless the situation was critical. I did not waste time with pleasantries. I told him I needed his immediate legal intervention. I told him my daughter and her husband had officially crossed the line from entitled insolence to active felony crimes. Oliver did not interrupt. He listened with the cold, calculating silence of a man preparing for war. I explained the demand for the massive Christmas event. I explained my tactical retreat to the mountain cabin. I detailed the security lockout and the subsequent freezing of the lake house. Oliver let out a low, appreciative chuckle. He commended my strategy. Then I told him about the breach. I informed him that Trent had bypassed the digital locks using a heavy steel crowbar. I told him about the shattered tempered glass and the unauthorized contractor currently ripping the main electrical panel apart in my basement. The amusement in Oliver's voice vanished instantly. It was replaced by a sharp, aggressive professional focus. He asked me if I had physical proof. He asked if my security system had captured the intrusion clearly. I smiled into the empty cabin. I tapped the screen of my phone and opened my encrypted cloud storage folder. I selected the high-definition video files the smart cameras had automatically uploaded. I hit the share button and forwarded the entire digital arsenal directly to Oliver's secure email server. I told him to check his inbox. I waited while he opened the files. I could hear the rapid clicking of his computer mouse over the phone line. The silence stretched for a full minute as Oliver reviewed the footage. I knew exactly what he was watching. He was watching Trent swing a heavy iron tool into my property. He was watching a clear, unobstructed 4K resolution recording of my son-in-law committing felony breaking and entering. He was watching the unlicensed electrician illegally tamper with a residential power grid. Oliver finally spoke. His voice was laced with pure predatory satisfaction. He told me the footage was absolutely flawless. He noted that Trent looked directly into the patio camera lens right before he shattered the glass. He stated that the local district attorney would not even need to deliberate. Trent had gifted us a perfectly documented, irrefutable felony case. Oliver explained the severe legal liability Trent had just triggered. Bypassing a digital smart grid with an unauthorized worker was not just vandalism. It was reckless endangerment. If that electrician caused a fire, Trent would be personally liable for massive damages. Oliver asked me if I wanted him to dispatch the state police to arrest Trent immediately. He said he could have Trent in handcuffs before the catering trucks even arrived. I told Oliver to hold his position. I told him arresting Trent right now was a temporary solution. Arresting him would stop the party, but it would not permanently sever the cord. Amanda would simply post his bail. They would hire a defense attorney. They would drag me into a messy, prolonged legal battle, claiming they had implied consent to enter the property. Amanda would cry in front of a judge and paint me as a vindictive, senile father attacking her innocent husband. I needed a permanent, insurmountable wall between them and my assets. I needed a maneuver that Trent could not fight with expensive lawyers or emotional manipulation. I took a deep breath. I walked over to the cabin window and watched the snow falling rapidly over the pines. I gave Oliver my final directive. 6 months ago, a massive luxury resort corporation named Apex Hospitality Group approached me. They were buying up prime waterfront real estate to build exclusive private villas. They offered me a staggering sum of cash for the lake house. They were relentless. They sent aggressive agents and mailed pristine contract offers. I had declined the offer because I was still sentimentally attached to the home I built with Mary. The sentiment was now entirely dead. Amanda and Trent had completely killed it. I spoke clearly into the receiver. I told Oliver to contact the Apex executives immediately. I told him to accept their cash offer today. Oliver was momentarily stunned. He asked if I was absolutely certain. He reminded me that I had built that house with my own hands. I replied that a house is only a home when it is filled with respect. Right now, it was just a building full of parasites. I instructed him to leverage his incredible legal connections and execute an emergency expedited closing. I wanted the property legally transferred to the corporate entity immediately. I wanted the resort company to take absolute legal possession on the exact morning Trent planned to host his 70 elite investors. Oliver processed the brutal brilliance of the strategy. If Apex Hospitality owned the property, Trent was no longer trespassing on a family home. He was trespassing on highly restricted commercial real estate owned by a billion-dollar corporation. He was damaging corporate assets. Corporate lawyers do not care about family drama. They care about liability and prosecution. Oliver laughed loudly. It was a dark, victorious sound. He told me he had a title company executive on speed dial. He said if the buyers wired the funds immediately, he could push the closing documents through the county clerk system by tomorrow morning. He would draft the digital transfer deeds within the hour. He promised to force the corporate buyers into an immediate signature. I thanked him and ended the call. The arsenal was fully secured. I placed my phone back on the table. Trent was currently standing inside the lake house, shivering in the freezing air, believing he had outsmarted me. He believed he had won. He was currently directing delivery men to set up expensive floral arrangements and premium bar stations inside a house that was rapidly slipping from my ownership to a faceless corporation. He was pouring his money into a sinking ship. He had no idea that I had just weaponized the very real estate he was trying to steal. I poured myself another cup of dark coffee. The legal guillotine was poised and ready to drop. Oliver Stanton did not simply practice corporate law. He weaponized it. Within 24 hours of my phone call from the frozen mountain cabin, the vast machinery of corporate acquisition was moving at a terrifying speed. Apex Hospitality Group had wanted to purchase my lake house for many months. Their original cash offer had been incredibly generous, but their executives had assumed I was just a stubborn, grieving widower clinging to the past. When Oliver contacted their lead acquisition director and coldly informed them that the property was immediately available for a pure cash purchase, they did not hesitate for a single second. They recognized a premium waterfront real estate opportunity. However, Oliver attached one absolute non-negotiable condition to the immediate sale. The entire transaction had to close in exactly 3 days. The title transfer, the massive wire of funds, and the legal change of ownership had to be officially recorded by the county clerk on the very morning of December 24th. The elite corporate attorneys representing Apex initially balked at the aggressive timeline. They argued that a 3-day closing window for a multi-million-dollar estate was logistically impossible. They cited mandatory title searches, environmental surveys, and standard bureaucratic delays. Oliver crushed their legal objections with absolute precision. He forwarded them the pristine property title history I had meticulously maintained. He provided the flawless environmental clearance reports I had commissioned the previous year when I upgraded the shoreline retaining wall. He reminded them that they were offering pure liquid cash, which entirely eliminated the need for tedious bank underwriting or mortgage approvals. He gave them a brutal ultimatum. They could close the deal on the morning of Christmas Eve, or he would call their direct luxury competitor and offer them the exact same exclusive portfolio. Apex Hospitality Group caved within 30 minutes. They desperately wanted the lake house to complete their new portfolio of luxury private villas, and they were willing to bypass their standard corporate bureaucracy to secure it. Oliver called me at the cabin to confirm the logistics. His voice crackled through the phone speaker sharp and entirely devoid of festive holiday cheer. He informed me that the buyer was already wiring the purchase funds into a secure legal escrow account. He had personally contacted the county clerk, calling in a massive political favor to ensure the deed transfer would be stamped and filed the moment the funds cleared the bank. The sheer velocity of the transaction was breathtaking. I was dismantling my entire physical legacy in the span of 72 hours. I sat at the heavy oak table in my mountain cabin and opened my laptop. The harsh glare of the screen illuminated the dark, quiet room. The winter storm continued to rage outside, piling fresh white snow against the window panes. Inside, the fire popped and hissed warmly in the cast-iron stove. I felt a profound sense of isolation, but it was a deeply healing isolation. I opened the encrypted email from Oliver. The subject line simply read, "Final closing documents." Attached was a massive digital file containing the legal transfer of the lake house property. I clicked the secure link to enter the legal portal. The digital contract spanned over 50 pages of dense terminology. It detailed the absolute forfeiture of my property rights. It outlined the complete transfer of the land, the physical structure, and all permanent fixtures to Apex Hospitality Group. I read through the stipulations with a steady, calm heartbeat. A year ago, the mere thought of selling the house Mary and I had built together would have paralyzed me with profound grief. We had selected the hardwood floors together. We had painted the crown molding. We had spent countless summer evenings sitting on the back deck watching the sun sink below the calm water. But Mary was gone, and the daughter we had raised together had willingly allowed that beautiful home to become a hollow, toxic status symbol. The house was no longer a monument to our loving marriage. It was nothing more than a stage for Trent's corporate theater. I reached the final page of the digital document. The electronic signature box blinked rapidly, waiting for my authorization. I did not hesitate for a fraction of a second. I typed my full legal name. I clicked the green confirmation button. The screen loaded for a brief moment before displaying a bright checkmark. The deed was officially done. I closed the laptop and walked over to the small kitchen to pour another cup of black coffee. I did not feel a sudden rush of sadness or regret. I felt a tremendous crushing weight lift completely from my tired shoulders. The heavy anchor tying me to Amanda's endless, arrogant demands had just been permanently severed. The following morning was December 24th. I woke up long before dawn. The mountain air was brutally cold, but the cabin remained a warm, quiet sanctuary. I picked up my smartphone and opened my secure banking application. I stared at the glowing screen in the dark. The legal escrow account had officially released the funds. A massive multi-million-dollar wire transfer had officially hit my personal checking account. The numbers were staggering to look at. It was more money than I could possibly spend in the remainder of my natural lifetime. I refreshed the county clerk public portal on my internet browser. The local property records had been officially updated. The lake house no longer belonged to George Bennett. It was entirely the legal private property of Apex Hospitality Group. Down in the snowy valley, Trent and Amanda were operating under a catastrophic delusion. Because my smart home security system was still connected to the local cellular network, I was receiving a constant stream of automated video alerts. I sat at my wooden dining table and watched the live feed of the chaos unfolding at the lake house. The unlicensed black market electrician Trent hired had successfully forced the power grid to remain active, but he had entirely destroyed the expensive smart panel in the process. The house was drawing massive amounts of electricity, fighting desperately against the freezing winter temperatures I had initiated. I watched Trent strut aggressively across the living room in his tailored suit, barking hostile orders at a frantic team of professional caterers. He was completely in his element, playing the role of the wealthy, highly successful executive. Amanda stood near the shattered patio door, which had been temporarily sealed with a thick sheet of industrial plastic and silver duct tape. She was loudly criticizing a floral designer who was struggling to arrange massive, expensive winter centerpieces around the damaged glass. I watched them pour thousands of dollars of their own money into a property they did not own. The premium catering company was currently unloading industrial warming trays and commercial cooking equipment. They were carrying heavy wooden crates of expensive vintage wine, imported artisan cheeses, and prime cuts of beef into the expansive kitchen. Trent had spared absolutely no expense to impress his senior business partners. I knew his personal financial situation was a crumbling house of cards. I knew he was financing this entire extravagant affair on high-interest corporate credit cards. He was digging himself into an inescapable pit of consumer debt to secure a promotion he falsely believed was guaranteed. He thought he was investing in his lucrative future. He had absolutely no idea that he was currently trespassing on commercial property. He was hanging expensive holiday wreaths and plugging in hundreds of decorative lights inside a building that now belonged to a ruthless luxury resort corporation. The supreme irony of the situation was exquisite. Amanda and Trent truly believed they had successfully bullied me into total submission. They thought my complete silence over the past 3 days was a clear sign of cowardly defeat. They assumed I was sitting alone in my mountain cabin, sulking, and deeply regretting my decision to challenge their supreme authority. They never possessed the intellectual capacity to understand that silence is often the sound of a perfectly constructed trap snapping shut. I watched the video feed as a massive towering ice sculpture was wheeled into the center of the living room by 2 struggling workers. It was carved precisely into the shape of Trent's corporate company logo. I shook my head at the sheer, unadulterated vanity of the freezing display. Amanda was walking around the room, snapping bright photographs on her phone to post on her social media profiles. She was bragging to her elite circle of wealthy friends about the magnificent holiday gala she was hosting at her private lake house. She was publicly claiming ownership of an asset that had actively transferred to a corporate entity just hours ago. Every single dollar they spent, every single caterer they hired, every piece of expensive decor they nailed to the wooden walls was a complete and total waste. They were enthusiastically decorating an active crime scene. Apex Hospitality Group was well known for their highly aggressive protection of their corporate assets. They employed teams of ruthless security contractors to fiercely monitor their empty properties. The exact moment their executives realized an unauthorized party was taking place inside their newly acquired multi-million-dollar villa, the legal response would be swift and devastating. Trent had built his entire adult life on a fragile foundation of lies, emotional manipulation, and my silent financial support. He had used my stolen money to construct his arrogant corporate persona. Amanda had continuously weaponized her mother's tragic death to force my endless compliance. Today, that entire toxic foundation was going to crumble into absolute dust. I did not turn off the camera feed on my phone. I wanted to witness the exact moment their delusions violently collided with the absolute unforgiving reality of the law. I poured myself another cup of hot coffee, leaned back in my wooden chair, and patiently waited for the wealthy investors to arrive. The trap was perfectly set, and the bait had been entirely swallowed. I sat beside the cast-iron stove in my mountain cabin and watched the digital drama unfold on my smartphone screen. The massive commercial catering trucks had managed to navigate the icy, winding roads leading to the lake house. They were currently parked haphazardly across my pristine, snow-covered driveway. The delivery workers were struggling to carry heavy metal warming trays and crates of expensive vintage champagne toward the front porch. Trent was barking aggressive orders while adjusting the collar of his cashmere coat. He was desperately trying to maintain the illusion of absolute control. He had ordered the unauthorized electrician to completely butcher my basement power grid. He had shattered my custom glass patio door with a steel crowbar. He firmly believed the worst of his logistical nightmare was behind him. He was entirely wrong. The sprawling lakeside neighborhood was not a standard residential subdivision. It was an exclusive gated community governed by a notoriously strict homeowners association. The community board employed a private security firm comprised of former military and law enforcement personnel. These guards patrolled the private roads 24 hours a day in heavily modified utility vehicles. They enforced strict regulations regarding noise levels, commercial vehicle weight limits, and unauthorized holiday events. I watched the live camera feed as a black security vehicle with flashing yellow lights pulled directly into my driveway. The heavy vehicle deliberately parked at an angle completely blocking the catering trucks from leaving or entering. 2 uniformed security officers stepped out into the freezing wind. I recognized the senior officer instantly. His name was Chief Evans. He was a retired state trooper who had patrolled this specific neighborhood for over a decade. He knew every single homeowner by their first name. He knew my face. He certainly knew I lived alone and despised massive, noisy gatherings. I watched the high-definition feed as Chief Evans approached Trent. Trent immediately deployed his polished corporate smile. He extended his hand and attempted to charm the stoic security officer. He likely assumed the guards were just low-wage employees he could easily intimidate or bribe. Chief Evans did not shake his hand. He stood with his arms crossed over his tactical vest and demanded to see the commercial event permit. The sensitive exterior microphones picked up the tense conversation. Trent let out a condescending laugh. He told the officer that he was the son-in-law of the homeowner. He claimed he was hosting an intimate private dinner for a few close colleagues and did not realize a permit was required. Chief Evans was entirely unmoved by the corporate posturing. He informed Trent that parking 3 heavy-duty commercial catering trucks in a private residential driveway constituted a major event. He stated that community bylaws explicitly required written authorization from the primary homeowner on record for any gathering exceeding 20 guests. He asked Trent to produce a signed lease agreement or a formal letter of consent from George Bennett. If Trent could not provide the documentation, the catering trucks would be immediately escorted off the premises. Trent lost his confident facade. His face flushed a deep, angry red. He stammered and looked frantically toward the broken front door. Amanda stepped out onto the freezing porch. She was wearing a thick designer winter coat over her elegant evening gown. She had been listening to the entire exchange. The situation was rapidly deteriorating into a catastrophic social disaster. Her 70 elite corporate investors were scheduled to arrive in less than 2 hours. If the caterers were forced to leave the property, her wealthy guests would walk into a freezing, broken house with absolutely no food or alcohol. Trent's promotion would evaporate instantly. Amanda's carefully curated social image would be permanently destroyed. They were completely cornered. I watched my daughter pace back and forth on the frozen wooden porch. I knew exactly what was racing through her mind. Amanda had never been held accountable for her actions. When she was a teenager in high school, she frequently forged my signature on permission slips and failing report cards. Mary had always discovered the deceit and covered it up. Mary would beg me not to punish her. Mary claimed Amanda was just an anxious child under immense academic pressure. I had enabled the behavior by remaining silent. I had allowed my daughter to believe that rules were entirely negotiable and consequences were easily avoided. Amanda believed she could manipulate any system to her advantage. She told Trent to stall the security officers. She turned around and ran back inside the freezing house. Trent began arguing loudly with Chief Evans about neighborhood access rights. He threatened to sue the homeowners association for harassment. Chief Evans simply pulled a citation pad from his vest and prepared to write a massive fine. 10 minutes later, Amanda emerged from the house. She held a crisp white piece of paper in her trembling hand. She marched down the icy driveway and shoved the document directly into the security officer's chest. She confidently declared that it was a short-term property rental agreement. She claimed her father had signed the lease earlier that week and explicitly authorized the corporate holiday gala. I zoomed in on the camera feed. Trent had brought a portable wireless printer to the house to prepare financial presentation documents for his investors. Amanda had clearly searched the internet for a generic residential lease template. She had filled out the digital form, filled in the dates for the weekend, and printed the document. Then she committed a staggering act of criminal desperation. She took a black ink pen and traced a forgery of my personal signature onto the bottom line of the contract. She blatantly falsified a legal document to appease a neighborhood security guard and save her husband's fragile ego. She thought it was just another high school permission slip. She thought it was a harmless white lie. She did not comprehend that she had just elevated their trespassing from a civil dispute into a severe felony offense. Chief Evans adjusted his radio earpiece and looked down at the forged document. He did not immediately accuse her of lying. He was a meticulous professional. He pulled a digital scanning tablet from his utility belt. He held the paper flat against the hood of his patrol vehicle and snapped a high-resolution photograph of the forged signature. He handed the physical paper back to Amanda. He told her that the neighborhood association would temporarily accept the document and allow the caterers to continue unloading their equipment. Amanda let out a loud, dramatic sigh of relief. Trent smirked and crossed his arms, looking incredibly smug. They thought they had successfully outsmarted the system. They thought their elite corporate party was completely saved. Chief Evans then delivered a procedural warning that wiped the arrogant smile entirely off Trent's face. The officer calmly stated that community bylaws mandated a strict verification process for all last-minute commercial rental agreements. He informed them that the digital scan of the lease he just took was automatically uploaded to the neighborhood security database. He stated that the system automatically forwarded a copy of the contract to the legal representative listed on the property deed. He told them the estate attorney would review the signature for final authorization. Chief Evans tipped his hat, got back into his patrol vehicle, and drove slowly away down the snowy street. Amanda and Trent stood frozen in the driveway. The caterers pushed past them carrying heavy boxes of crystal glasses. The trap I had been carefully setting for 3 days had just violently snapped shut. My smartphone vibrated loudly against the wooden table in my mountain cabin. The caller identification did not display a security alert. It displayed the name of Oliver Stanton. I picked up the device and accepted the call. I brought the speaker to my ear and listened to my oldest friend laugh. It was a dark, triumphant sound that echoed perfectly in the quiet room. Oliver did not bother with a greeting. He practically shouted through the phone line with sheer predatory excitement. He told me he had just received an automated email notification from the Lakeside Homeowners Association. He said the attached file was the most spectacularly stupid piece of evidence he had ever witnessed in his 40 years of practicing law. He described the document in vivid detail. He read the terms of the generic lease agreement out loud. He confirmed that the contract granted Trent full authorization to host a commercial event with unlimited guests. Then Oliver paused. His voice dropped an octave, turning completely lethal. He told me he was looking at the signature at the bottom of the page. He said it was a sloppy, desperate imitation of my handwriting. I told Oliver I had watched Amanda forge the document live on my security cameras. I explained that she panicked when the neighborhood patrol threatened to turn away the catering trucks. Oliver let out a sharp whistle of disbelief. He explained the catastrophic magnitude of her mistake. By forging a signature on a legal contract and presenting it to a licensed security officer, Amanda had committed felony forgery. Because she used that forged document to secure a financial advantage and bypass commercial event fees, she had committed fraud. Because the guards transmitted the document over a cellular network to a legal database, she had technically triggered wire fraud statutes. Oliver stated that she had just handed us the ultimate weapon. I looked out the cabin window at the heavy snow blanketing the pine trees. Trent and Amanda were currently standing inside a freezing house. They had broken a glass door. They had illegally bypassed a sophisticated electrical grid. They had authorized thousands of dollars in catering expenses. Now they had submitted a forged legal document to a security agency. They were pouring their entire financial future into a property that legally belonged to Apex Hospitality Group. They had absolutely no idea that the corporate transfer deed had been officially recorded hours ago. They were not just trespassing on my property anymore. They were actively committing felonies on commercial real estate owned by a billion-dollar resort corporation. I told Oliver to prepare the final strike. The execution was imminent. The interior of the lake house was completely transformed into a glittering spectacle of manufactured wealth and corporate excess. 70 elite investors and senior managing partners filled the expansive living room. The air was thick with the scent of expensive catered delicacies and the rich aroma of imported floral arrangements that masked the lingering chill of the recently frozen house. Waiters in crisp black uniforms circulated smoothly through the crowd, carrying silver trays loaded with seared scallops and crystal flutes of vintage champagne. The massive central heating unit roared constantly in the basement, fighting to push warm air through the vents to compensate for the frigid winter wind pressing against the temporary industrial plastic that now covered the shattered patio door. The wealthy guests mingled enthusiastically, completely oblivious to the fact that they were standing inside an active crime scene. They admired the soaring vaulted ceilings and the polished hardwood floors, assuming they were guests in a private sanctuary of unparalleled success. Amanda glided through the room in a stunning emerald evening gown, playing the role of the flawless hostess. She laughed loudly at every joke offered by the senior partners and gracefully directed the catering staff with subtle flicks of her wrist. She felt an overwhelming sense of triumph. She believed she had successfully navigated a logistical nightmare and secured her husband's professional future. The forged rental agreement she had shoved into the chest of the neighborhood security guard was entirely forgotten in the glow of her social victory. She was basking in the admiration of 70 highly influential people who believed she and Trent owned this magnificent waterfront estate. The fragile illusion was holding perfectly steady under the warm ambient lighting. Trent stood near the massive stone fireplace at the far end of the room, holding a half-empty glass of expensive bourbon. He wore his custom-tailored Italian suit with supreme confidence. He felt absolutely invincible. He had broken a window with a crowbar, bypassed a sophisticated security grid, and outsmarted the local neighborhood patrol. He surveyed the crowded room and felt a deep, intoxicating rush of power. He believed he had conquered his father-in-law and asserted his dominance over the family hierarchy. He tapped a silver spoon against the rim of his crystal glass. The sharp ringing sound cut through the low hum of conversation and the soft classical music playing from the scattered wireless speakers. The room slowly quieted down as 70 wealthy investors turned their attention toward the confident young executive standing by the hearth. Trent raised his glass and offered a bright, polished smile to his colleagues. His voice was smooth and perfectly calibrated, to project authority and humble gratitude. He thanked the senior partners for braving the treacherous winter roads to join him on Christmas Eve. He spoke passionately about the value of hard work, dedication, and the importance of securing a stable financial legacy. He swept his arm across the room, gesturing to the vaulted ceilings and the expansive view of the frozen lake outside the windows. He smoothly lied to his audience, claiming that this pristine property was a symbol of his unyielding commitment to excellence. He told them that a man who can build and maintain a fortress like this is a man who can be trusted to manage multi-million-dollar corporate portfolios. His breathtaking arrogance was absolute. He stood in a house he did not own, claiming it as the physical manifestation of his personal financial stability. He spoke of wealth and responsibility while completely ignoring the dark reality of his own actions. Exactly 3 years ago, Trent had sat weeping on the very same sofa currently occupied by a senior investor. He had begged George for a $50,000 loan to save his failing boutique consulting firm. George had drained his own retirement funds to provide that lifeline. Trent had never repaid a single dime of that $50,000. He had used the stolen money to lease premium office space, buy designer suits, and construct the very facade he was presenting tonight. He felt absolutely entitled to George's assets. He viewed his father-in-law's wealth as his own personal safety net. He raised his glass higher and proposed a toast to the upcoming year of lucrative partnerships and guaranteed corporate promotions. The investors applauded enthusiastically and raised their champagne flutes in unified agreement. 10 miles away on the treacherous, winding mountain road, the reality of Trent's situation was descending rapidly through the freezing winter storm. George Bennett sat in the passenger seat of a heavy luxury sport utility vehicle. The powerful heater blasted warm air across the leather interior, but George felt entirely cold and perfectly detached. He watched the dark pine trees blur past the window as the vehicle navigated the slick asphalt. He was not driving. The vehicle belonged to Oliver Stanton. Oliver gripped the steering wheel with absolute precision, navigating the dangerous curves with the predatory focus of a man moving in for a final kill. Oliver wore a sharp charcoal overcoat and a grim, satisfied smile. He had spent the entire morning pulling massive legal levers and cashing in decades of political favors to execute the fastest commercial real estate transfer in county history. Behind Oliver's heavy vehicle, a sleek black corporate town car followed closely through the falling snow. Inside the town car sat 2 senior acquisition executives from Apex Hospitality Group. They were not festive holiday guests. They were ruthless corporate operatives tasked with protecting a billion-dollar portfolio. They held the freshly stamped deed of ownership, proving their corporation had legally acquired the lake house at exactly 9 in the morning. They had received the forwarded security footage showing Trent smashing the patio door and an unauthorized contractor ripping apart the electrical grid of their newly purchased asset. They were absolutely furious. They were traveling to the property to personally document the extensive damages and ensure the immediate prosecution of the trespassers. The convoy was completed by 3 distinct local police cruisers trailing directly behind the corporate town car. The flashing yellow light bars on their roofs cut through the heavy snowfall, warning other drivers to pull aside. The authorities had been fully briefed by Oliver Stanton. This was no longer a simple domestic dispute or a minor neighborhood noise complaint. The police were responding to a confirmed felony forgery combined with severe property damage and criminal trespassing on highly restricted commercial real estate. The police chief had personally reviewed the digital scan of the lease agreement Amanda had handed to the neighborhood patrol. He had compared the signature to George's verified legal documents. The forgery was blatant, sloppy, and entirely illegal. The trap was locked and the executioners were arriving. George stared out the windshield as the convoy reached the bottom of the mountain and approached the entrance of the exclusive gated community. The massive wrought iron gates were already swinging wide open. Chief Evans and the private security patrol had been expecting them. The security guards stood rigidly by their posts and saluted the local police cruisers as they rolled through the entrance. The convoy did not slow down. They navigated the winding neighborhood roads with aggressive, unified purpose. The sprawling lakeside houses passed by in a blur of festive holiday decorations and quiet, snowy lawns. George felt the weight of 30 years of parental enabling finally lifting from his shoulders. He was no longer trying to fix a broken family. He was officially amputating a toxic limb. The lake house finally came into view at the end of the long private road. The property was blazing with golden interior light. The thumping bass of the expensive sound system vibrated through the freezing night air. The massive catering trucks were still parked haphazardly across the snowy driveway, blocking the main path to the garage. Oliver slowed his heavy vehicle and shifted into park directly behind the commercial trucks. The black corporate town car pulled up sharply beside him. The 3 police cruisers fanned out across the base of the driveway, forming an impenetrable barricade. The officers did not hesitate. They reached up to their dashboard consoles and activated their primary emergency lights. The sudden explosion of brilliant red and blue strobes instantly shattered the peaceful darkness of the neighborhood. The intense flashing lights bounced aggressively off the white snowbanks and illuminated the towering pine trees. The colors swept rapidly across the frozen driveway and struck the front of the lake house with violent, undeniable force. The red and blue beams penetrated the large front windows, cutting directly through the warm, ambient glow of the elegant party inside. The flashing lights painted the shocked faces of the wealthy investors standing near the glass. The cheerful music seemed to instantly lose its power as the visual reality of the police barricade paralyzed the 70 guests. George opened the heavy door of the sport utility vehicle and stepped out into the freezing wind. His boots crunched loudly against the frozen gravel. Oliver stepped out beside him, adjusting the collar of his charcoal coat. The 2 corporate executives emerged from their town car, clutching their leather briefcases with grim determination. 5 uniformed police officers stepped out of their cruisers and rested their hands casually over their duty belts. They formed a solid, unified line across the base of the driveway. George looked up at the glittering windows of the home he had built with his own hands. He saw the silhouettes of the panicked guests shifting away from the glass. He saw Trent standing frozen near the fireplace. The facade was officially dead. George nodded silently to the police officers. They began the slow, steady, and absolute march up the snowy driveway toward the front door. The crunch of shattered tempered glass, echoing under my heavy winter boots, was the only sound cutting through the sudden suffocating silence of the living room. I stepped through the ruined frame of the patio door, letting the bitter mountain wind rush past my shoulders and sweep directly into the center of the extravagant holiday gala. At the exact same moment, the heavy oak front doors swung open to reveal the solid wall of uniformed police officers flanking Oliver Stanton and the 2 corporate executives. The flashing red and blue lights from the cruisers parked in the driveway bathed the opulent room in an aggressive, rhythmic strobe. The harsh emergency lights reflected off the crystal champagne flutes, the silver catering trays, and the massive, slowly melting ice sculpture of Trent's corporate logo. The transition from a high society celebration to an active crime scene occurred in a matter of seconds. The upbeat classical holiday music was abruptly severed by one of the catering staff pulling a power cord. 70 elite investors, managing partners, and wealthy socialites froze entirely in place. They stood absolutely motionless, their expensive tailored suits and elegant evening gowns suddenly looking completely out of place under the glaring strobe lights of law enforcement. Waiters in crisp black uniforms stopped mid-stride, lowering their silver trays of seared scallops and imported cheeses. The ambient warmth of the illegally bypassed central heating unit was rapidly vanishing, replaced by the freezing winter chill blowing in from the shattered patio door behind me. I stood perfectly still, just inside the threshold, my hands resting calmly in the pockets of my winter coat, and watched the magnificent collapse of my son-in-law's completely fabricated empire. Trent stood near the massive stone fireplace holding a crystal glass of expensive bourbon. For a fraction of a second, raw, unfiltered panic flashed across his perfectly groomed face. He looked at the shattered glass at my feet, then at the police officers securing the front entrance, and finally at the 70 highly influential colleagues watching him closely. I could see the desperate calculations racing behind his eyes. His entire professional reputation, his highly coveted promotion, and his fragile social standing were hanging by a microscopic thread. He realized he had to control the narrative instantly or face total social and financial ruin. His survival instinct kicked in, overriding any sense of shame or reality. Trent handed his bourbon glass to a frozen waiter and marched purposefully across the polished hardwood floor toward me. He did not approach with anger or hostility. Instead, he deployed a chillingly smooth, patronizing smile. He was pivoting to play the ultimate victim, a role he had practiced and perfected over years of financial parasitism. He held his hands up in a gesture of peaceful surrender, addressing the silent room of investors and the police officers simultaneously. His voice was projected with clear, practiced corporate authority, layered with a sickeningly sweet tone of manufactured grief. He loudly apologized to his esteemed guests for the unfortunate interruption. He gestured toward me with a look of profound, fabricated sadness. He told the room that his elderly father-in-law was unfortunately suffering from severe, rapidly advancing dementia. He claimed that I was experiencing a tragic medical episode, a terrible bout of late-stage paranoia and confusion. He lied with breathtaking ease, stating that my mind was deteriorating, causing me to act out aggressively against my own loving family. He told the police officers that I had wandered down from my mountain cabin in a state of delusion, trying to sabotage a simple family Christmas gathering, because I no longer understood reality. He asked the officers to please be gentle with me, requesting that they help escort his poor sick father-in-law back to a quiet room so I could rest. I listened to his monologue with absolute icy detachment. This was not a new tactic. 3 years ago, when I briefly questioned his failure to repay the $50,000 business loan, Trent had subtly suggested to Amanda that my memory was failing and I simply forgot the terms of our agreement. He had always utilized my age as a weapon to invalidate my boundaries and excuse his own financial crimes. He was actively gaslighting me in front of 70 witnesses, attempting to completely strip me of my dignity, my agency, and my legal rights to protect his fragile ego. He genuinely believed that his expensive suit and his confident vocabulary would convince the authorities that I was nothing more than a tragic, senile burden. I did not yell. I did not attempt to argue with his vicious lies. I did not raise my voice to defend my sanity. When you hold all the winning cards, you do not need to scream. You simply lay them on the table. I pulled my hands from my coat pockets. I reached into the interior breast pocket of my heavy jacket and withdrew the thick, crisp manila envelope Oliver Stanton had provided me earlier. I completely ignored Trent's outstretched hands. I walked straight past him, forcing him to step aside, and approached the lead police officer standing near the grand entryway. The entire room watched in absolute, breathless silence. I handed the envelope directly to the officer. I spoke in a clear, resonant voice that carried easily across the expansive living room, reaching the ears of every single corporate investor present. I informed the officer that the man in the cashmere coat had forcibly broken the tempered glass patio door with a steel crowbar to gain illegal entry into the building. I stated that he had brought an unlicensed contractor into the basement to criminally bypass a locked residential power grid, recklessly endangering the entire structure. I explained that the envelope contained the finalized, legally binding property deed, stamped and officially recorded by the county clerk at 9 o'clock this morning. I told the officer that the building we were currently standing in was no longer my private residence. As the police officer opened the envelope and reviewed the pristine legal documents, the 2 executives from Apex Hospitality Group stepped forward from the line of authorities. They were dressed in immaculate dark suits, projecting an aura of genuine, unyielding corporate power that made Trent's posturing look like a cheap theatrical performance. The lead executive turned to address the crowd of stunned investors. His voice was clinical, absolute, and devoid of any sympathy. He introduced himself as the Regional Acquisition Director for Apex Hospitality Group. He announced clearly and loudly that the corporation had executed a total cash purchase of the estate that very morning. He declared that the property was now classified as highly restricted private commercial real estate belonging entirely to a billion-dollar resort conglomerate. He swept his gaze across the room, making direct eye contact with Trent's senior managing partners. He informed them that the gathering was an unauthorized illegal intrusion. He stated that every single caterer, every delivery worker, and every guest standing in the room was actively trespassing on corporate property. He demanded that the premises be immediately vacated so their security teams could assess the severe structural damages caused by the illegal break-in. The reaction from the 70 elite corporate guests was instantaneous and entirely devastating. These were highly intelligent, calculating money managers. They understood legal liability. They recognized a catastrophic public relations disaster the second it materialized. They did not wait for the police to issue a formal dispersal order. The investors immediately set their expensive champagne flutes down on the nearest tables. They turned their backs completely on Trent. They moved swiftly and silently toward the cloakroom to retrieve their winter coats. They avoided looking at Trent as they marched out the front doors, fleeing the toxic fallout of his monumental lies. Trent stood completely paralyzed by the fireplace, his mouth slightly open, watching his career, his promotion, and his entire social standing evaporate into the freezing winter night. The corporate colleagues he had desperately tried to impress were actively abandoning him to face felony trespassing charges. Suddenly, a loud, shrill voice shattered the heavy tension in the room. Amanda pushed her way through the retreating crowd of investors. Her elegant emerald evening gown swept across the polished floor as she ran toward the police officers. Her face was flushed with pure panic and desperate indignation. She could not accept the reality of her collapsing social empire. She reached into her designer clutch and pulled out the crumpled piece of paper she had shown the neighborhood security patrol earlier that afternoon. She waved the document frantically in the air, shoving it aggressively toward the lead police officer. She screamed that the corporate executives were lying. She shrieked that her father had legally authorized the event. She pointed a trembling finger directly at me, demanding that I tell the police the truth. She yelled that she possessed a signed, legally binding short-term rental lease proving they had every right to occupy the property and host the holiday gala. She committed entirely to the fabricated reality she had constructed, desperate to save face in front of the few remaining caterers and lingering guests. I looked at my daughter, feeling a profound, quiet sorrow mixed with absolute resolution. I recognized the exact same stubborn, defiant expression she used to wear as a teenager when she forged my signature on failing report cards to avoid being grounded. She still believed that a simple piece of paper and a loud tantrum could manipulate the consequences of her actions. She did not comprehend that forging a high school math test was a minor disciplinary issue, while forging a residential lease agreement to deceive law enforcement and bypass commercial property regulations was a severe federal offense. The police officer took the crumpled paper from Amanda's shaking hand. He looked down at the generic rental template. He looked at the sloppy, desperate imitation of my signature scribbled on the bottom line. He then looked at the pristine, officially recorded corporate deed resting in his other hand. Oliver Stanton stepped forward, folding his arms across his chest with a grim, victorious smile. He informed the officer that he was the legal representative for the estate, and he could definitively confirm that the signature on the lease was a blatant, malicious forgery. He stated that Amanda had just willingly surrendered physical evidence of felony fraud directly into the hands of an active police investigation. Amanda froze. The color drained completely from her face. She looked at the forged paper in the officer's hand, then slowly turned her head to look at me. The arrogant fire in her eyes extinguished instantly, replaced by the crushing, terrifying realization of her fatal error. She had tried to outsmart the system one final time, and she had just handed the authorities the very rope needed to hang them both. The trap was no longer just a locked door or a frozen thermostat. It was a flawless, inescapable legal vault, and the heavy steel door had just slammed completely shut. The freezing winter wind rushed past my heavy canvas coat as I stepped carefully over the jagged shards of tempered glass, covering the polished hardwood floor. I crossed the threshold of the ruined patio door and entered the opulent living room. The interior was a breathtaking display of manufactured wealth and staggering corporate excess. 70 elite investors and senior managing partners stood in small, elegant clusters. Waiters in crisp black uniforms circulated smoothly through the crowd, carrying silver trays loaded with seared scallops and crystal flutes of vintage champagne. The air was thick with the scent of catered delicacies and the rich aroma of imported floral arrangements. Trent stood confidently by the massive stone fireplace at the far end of the room. He held a half-empty glass of expensive bourbon and addressed his captive audience. He was delivering a remarkably smug and polished speech about his financial stability. He gestured grandly toward the vaulted ceilings and the expansive view of the frozen lake outside the windows. He smoothly lied to his colleagues, claiming that this pristine property was the ultimate symbol of his personal success and his unyielding commitment to excellence. He told them that a man who could build and maintain a magnificent fortress like this was a man who could be entirely trusted to manage multi-million-dollar corporate portfolios. His breathtaking arrogance was absolute. He was standing in a house he did not own, claiming it as the physical manifestation of his own financial brilliance. He was entirely oblivious to the flashing red and blue strobe lights cutting through the falling snow outside the front windows. The heavy oak doors at the main entrance suddenly swung wide open. 5 uniformed police officers stepped into the foyer, followed closely by Oliver Stanton and the 2 corporate executives from Apex Hospitality Group. One of the catering staff immediately reached out and pulled the power cord from the wireless speaker system. The upbeat classical holiday music died instantly. A sudden suffocating silence fell over the massive room. The 70 wealthy guests froze completely in place. Their expensive tailored suits and elegant evening gowns suddenly looked entirely out of place under the harsh glaring strobe lights of active law enforcement. Trent stopped mid-sentence. His confident corporate smile melted off his face. Raw, unfiltered panic flashed across his perfectly groomed features as he looked at the police officers securing the front entrance, and then turned his head to see me standing silently by the shattered patio glass. He could feel the desperate calculations racing behind his eyes. His entire professional reputation, his highly coveted promotion, and his fragile social standing were hanging by a microscopic thread. He realized he had to control the narrative instantly or face total social and financial ruin. His survival instinct kicked in, overriding any sense of shame or reality. He handed his bourbon glass to a paralyzed waiter and marched purposefully across the room toward me. He did not approach with anger or hostility. Instead, he deployed a chillingly smooth, patronizing smile. He was pivoting to play the ultimate victim. He held his hands up in a gesture of peaceful surrender, addressing the silent room of investors and the police officers simultaneously. He loudly apologized to his esteemed guests for the unfortunate interruption. He gestured toward me with a look of profound, fabricated sadness. He told the room that his elderly father-in-law was unfortunately suffering from severe, rapidly advancing dementia. He claimed that I was experiencing a tragic medical episode, a terrible bout of late-stage paranoia and confusion. He lied with absolute ease, stating that my mind was deteriorating, causing me to act out aggressively against my own loving family. He told the police officers that I had wandered down from my mountain cabin in a state of delusion, trying to sabotage a simple family Christmas gathering because I no longer understood reality. He asked the officers to please be gentle with me, requesting that they help escort his poor sick father-in-law back to a quiet room so I could rest. I listened to his monologue with absolute icy detachment. This was not a new tactic. 3 years ago, when I briefly questioned his failure to repay the $50,000 business loan, Trent had subtly suggested to Amanda that my memory was failing, and I simply forgot the terms of our agreement. He had always utilized my age as a weapon to invalidate my boundaries and excuse his own financial crimes. He was actively gaslighting me in front of 70 witnesses, attempting to completely strip me of my dignity, my agency, and my legal rights to protect his fragile ego. He genuinely believed that his expensive suit and his confident vocabulary would convince the authorities that I was nothing more than a tragic, senile burden. I did not yell. I did not attempt to argue with his vicious lies. I did not raise my voice to defend my sanity. I pulled my hands from my coat pockets. I reached into the interior breast pocket of my heavy jacket and withdrew the thick, crisp manila envelope Oliver Stanton had provided me earlier. I completely ignored Trent's outstretched hands. I walked straight past him, forcing him to step aside, and approached the lead police officer standing near the grand entryway. The entire room watched in absolute, breathless silence. I handed the envelope directly to the officer. I informed the officer that the man in the cashmere coat had forcibly broken the tempered glass patio door with a steel crowbar to gain illegal entry into the building. I stated that he had brought an unlicensed contractor into the basement to criminally bypass a locked residential power grid, recklessly endangering the entire structure. I explained that the envelope contained the finalized, legally binding property deed, stamped and officially recorded by the county clerk at 9 o'clock this morning. I told the officer that the building we were currently standing in was no longer my private residence. As the police officer opened the envelope and reviewed the pristine legal documents, the two executives from Apex Hospitality Group stepped forward from the line of authorities. They were dressed in immaculate dark suits, projecting an aura of genuine, unyielding corporate power that made Trent's posturing look like a cheap, theatrical performance. The lead executive turned to address the crowd of stunned investors. His voice was clinical, absolute, and devoid of any sympathy. He introduced himself as the Regional Acquisition Director for the Resort Corporation. He announced clearly and loudly that the corporation had executed a total cash purchase of the estate that very morning. He declared that the property was now classified as highly restricted, private commercial real estate belonging entirely to a billion-dollar conglomerate. He swept his gaze across the room, making direct eye contact with Trent's senior managing partners. He informed them that the gathering was an unauthorized, illegal intrusion. He stated that every single caterer, every delivery worker, and every guest standing in the room was actively trespassing on corporate property. He demanded that the premises be immediately vacated so their security teams could assess the severe structural damages caused by the illegal break-in. Suddenly, a loud, shrill voice shattered the heavy tension in the room. Amanda pushed her way through the paralyzed crowd of investors. Her elegant emerald evening gown swept across the polished floor as she ran toward the police officers. Her face was flushed with pure panic and desperate indignation. She could not accept the reality of her collapsing social empire. She reached into her designer clutch and pulled out the crumpled piece of paper she had shown the neighborhood security patrol earlier that afternoon. She waved the document frantically in the air, shoving it aggressively toward the lead police officer. She screamed that the corporate executives were lying. She shrieked that her father had legally authorized the event. She pointed a trembling finger directly at me, demanding that I tell the police the truth. She yelled that she possessed a signed, legally binding short-term rental lease proving they had every right to occupy the property and host the holiday gala. She committed entirely to the fabricated reality she had constructed, desperate to save face in front of the few remaining caterers and lingering guests. The police officer took the crumpled paper from Amanda's shaking hand. He looked down at the generic rental template. He looked at the sloppy, desperate imitation of my signature, scribbled on the bottom line. He then looked at the pristine, officially recorded corporate deed resting in his other hand. Oliver Stanton stepped forward, folding his arms across his chest, with a grim, victorious smile. He informed the officer that he was the legal representative for the estate, and he could definitively confirm that the signature on the lease was a blatant, malicious forgery. He stated for the official police record that I had been sitting in my isolated mountain cabin 30 miles away for the past 24 hours. He noted that there was absolutely no physical or digital way I could have signed a paper document in this valley. He explained the legal parameters of her actions to the silent room. She had not simply lied to a neighborhood patrol guard. She had committed felony forgery. She had attempted to execute a fraudulent contract to secure a financial advantage on property owned by a billion-dollar corporation. He told her she had escalated a trespassing charge into a severe federal offense. Oliver then reached into his overcoat and produced a high-definition tablet. He tapped the screen and maximized the brightness. He held it high and turned the volume to its maximum setting. The sharp, aggressive sound of crunching snow and heavy breathing filled the silent living room. Every single wealthy guest turned their attention to the screen. Trent appeared on the tablet wearing his expensive coat, holding a massive steel crowbar. The audio captured him cursing violently before swinging the iron tool backward. The deafening crash of tempered security glass shattering echoed through the speakers. The investors flinched at the violent noise. The video shifted to the basement camera showing the unlicensed contractor ripping the digital power matrix off the concrete wall in a shower of yellow sparks. Oliver locked his eyes onto the senior partners of Trent's consulting firm. He asked them if a man who violently breaks into a secured property and illegally tampers with an electrical grid was someone they trusted with their multi-million-dollar portfolios. The reaction from the 70 elite corporate guests was instantaneous and entirely devastating. These were highly intelligent, calculating money managers. They understood legal liability. They recognized a catastrophic public relations disaster the second it materialized. The senior managing partner of Trent's firm stepped forward. He looked at Trent with absolute total contempt. He set his crystal champagne flute down on a silver catering tray. The soft clinking sound signaled the definitive end of Trent's career. The senior partner turned his back on Trent and walked directly toward the cloakroom. That single silent action triggered a mass exodus. The wealthy investors placed their drinks on tables, shelves, and the fireplace mantel. They moved with a hurried, frantic energy. They wanted to evacuate the premises before the police officers began taking official witness statements. They wanted zero association with a man facing imminent felony charges. They muttered quietly among themselves, shaking their heads in sheer disgust as the extravagant holiday gala transformed into a desperate evacuation. Trent stood entirely paralyzed, watching his future turn to dust. The trap had finally snapped shut. The lead police officer stepped forward, and his heavy black boots echoed loudly against the polished hardwood floor. He did not issue a polite request to the man standing by the grand stone fireplace. He delivered a firm verbal command instructing Trent to immediately turn around and place his hands behind his back. Trent seemed completely unable to process the instruction. He stood frozen on the expensive imported rug. His mouth opened and closed repeatedly, but no sound came out. The polished, confident corporate executive was entirely gone. He was replaced by a terrified man, realizing his carefully fabricated world had just violently collapsed around him. Two officers approached him directly. They grabbed his arms and spun him around with practiced efficiency. Trent stumbled awkwardly, losing his balance. His expensive tailored cashmere coat bunched up around his shoulders as the officers forced his hands together. The sharp, metallic clicking sound of the heavy steel handcuffs locking around his wrists cut clearly through the silent room. The lead officer began reciting the legal rights in a loud, monotone voice. He stated that Trent was being placed under arrest for felony breaking and entering alongside severe criminal property damage and trespassing on restricted commercial real estate. Trent looked completely pale. His eyes darted around the empty room, desperately searching for any remaining investors to save him from this nightmare. There was no one left to impress. The officers held him firmly in place. Amanda watched her husband being handcuffed. Her breathing became rapid and incredibly shallow. She took a slow, trembling step backward until her back hit the cold stone of the fireplace. The female police officer approached her next. The officer reached out and took firm hold of Amanda's wrist. Amanda tried to pull her arm away in a sudden panic. She shook her head rapidly and insisted there was a massive misunderstanding. She claimed she was the daughter of the homeowner and could absolutely not be arrested in her own family house. The officer completely ignored her protests. She smoothly secured Amanda's hands behind her back. The second set of handcuffs clicked shut. The sound was incredibly loud and final in the vast living room. The officer informed Amanda she was being placed under arrest for felony forgery, wire fraud, and providing false legal documents to licensed security personnel. Amanda's designer emerald evening gown suddenly looked entirely ridiculous. It was no longer a symbol of high society status or wealth. It was just a thin, fragile costume worn by a criminal caught in the act. The heavy silver jewelry around her neck seemed to physically weigh her down. She looked down at the cold steel chains binding her wrists. The physical reality of the metal finally shattered her profound delusion of untouchable privilege. The supreme arrogance that had defined my daughter and her husband for years evaporated completely in a matter of seconds. Amanda let out a loud guttural sob that echoed off the vaulted ceilings. Her knees simply buckled beneath her. She dropped heavily onto the polished hardwood floor right beside the shattered glass. The expensive fabric of her gown pooled around her knees in a dark green circle. She looked up at me with tears streaming down her face. Her carefully applied elegant makeup was instantly ruined by the heavy flow of dark mascara running down her cheeks. She begged me to tell the police officers to stop. She pleaded with me to drop the criminal charges immediately. She cried that she was my only daughter and that I was supposed to protect her from the harsh world. She sobbed violently, pleading for me to fix this terrible mistake, just like I had always fixed her mistakes in the past. She promised she would never ask for money again. She promised she would be a perfect daughter and visit me at the mountain cabin. She was completely stripped of her manipulative power. Her tears had always been her ultimate weapon against my boundaries, but tonight they were useless. She was just a terrified person facing the absolute unyielding consequences of her own malicious actions. Trent watched his wife sobbing hysterically on the floor. He tried to step toward me, but the police officers held him back with a firm grip on his shoulders. He decided to try a completely different tactic. He attempted to appeal to my sense of family loyalty and paternal pride. He spoke in a rapid, desperate voice. His words stumbled over each other as he tried to construct a believable lie. He told me that everything he did was entirely for the family. He claimed he only broke into the lake house and staged the massive unauthorized holiday party because he wanted to secure his senior partnership promotion. He spun a pathetic narrative stating that he desperately wanted to make me proud of him. He said he wanted to prove that he was a highly successful man capable of providing a lavish lifestyle for Amanda. He begged me to tell the corporate executives from the resort company that this was all a private family matter that got out of hand. He promised he would personally pay for the broken glass door and the damaged basement electrical panel. He swore he would compensate the resort corporation for any inconvenience and sign whatever documents they needed. He pleaded with me to understand the immense pressure he was under in the competitive corporate world. He asked me to show mercy and drop the criminal complaints. He stated that going to jail would permanently destroy his professional license and ruin his life forever. I stood perfectly still near the freezing doorway and looked down at them. I did not feel a sudden surge of righteous anger. I did not feel a familiar wave of parental guilt. I did not feel any lingering pity for their self-inflicted destruction. I felt a profound, absolute emotional detachment. The heavy burden of endless financial and emotional obligation I had carried for decades was completely gone. I looked at Amanda crying on the floor and Trent sweating in his ruined expensive suit. I realized they were entirely strangers to me. The daughter I had loved and the son-in-law I had tried to support had slowly erased themselves through years of relentless greed and calculated manipulation. I spoke in a steady, quiet voice that carried easily through the cold room. I told Amanda that I could not drop the charges even if I miraculously wanted to. I reminded her that she had intentionally forged a legal document involving commercial property owned by a corporate entity. The police officers were not arresting her on my behalf. They were arresting her on behalf of the state and the billion-dollar resort corporation she had attempted to defraud. I told her that my parental protection could not extend into the realm of federal felonies and corporate litigation. I then turned my attention to Trent. He stopped his frantic pleading and looked at me with wide, terrified eyes. I told him his desperate speech about family loyalty and making me proud was a complete fabrication. I told him he had never cared about my pride or my well-being. He only cared about my bank accounts and my willingness to fund his delusions of grandeur. I kept my voice entirely level and calm. I told Trent that I had one final piece of information he desperately needed to hear before the officers took him away. I informed him that Oliver Stanton had been incredibly busy while Trent was distracted by his holiday party preparations and ice sculptures. I stated that Oliver had officially filed the complex legal paperwork to execute a massive judgment on the $50,000 business loan Trent had taken from me 3 years ago. I explained that because Trent had brazenly ignored the written terms of the loan and refused to make a single payment, Oliver had easily secured an emergency court order. I watched Trent's eyes widen in absolute horror as the reality set in. I told him that as we stood here speaking in this freezing room, the bank was actively freezing and seizing his remaining personal and business accounts to repay the stolen funds. Trent let out a low, choking sound deep in his throat. His legs wobbled uncontrollably, and the police officers had to physically support his weight to keep him from collapsing. He finally understood the total magnitude of his absolute defeat. He was not just facing years in a state penitentiary for commercial breaking and entering and property damage. He was completely financially ruined. The money he used to project his wealthy lifestyle was entirely gone. The funds he desperately needed to hire premium criminal defense attorneys were currently being seized by the courts to repay the debt he had arrogantly ignored for years. His luxury vehicles and designer watches would be repossessed to satisfy the outstanding balance. He had nothing left. He had built his entire identity on stolen money and fragile lies, and I had just meticulously dismantled the very foundation of his existence. He looked down at the floor, completely defeated and utterly silent. The lead police officer instructed his team to move the suspects out of the building. They pulled Trent forward, guiding him firmly toward the shattered patio door and out into the freezing winter night. Another officer gently but firmly pulled Amanda up from the hardwood floor. She continued to sob loudly, her voice echoing against the vaulted ceilings as she was led away in her ruined designer gown. The 2 corporate executives from the resort company stepped forward with their clipboards to begin their formal damage assessment of their new commercial property. Oliver Stanton walked over and stood quietly beside me. We watched through the broken glass as the police officers escorted Trent and Amanda down the long, snowy driveway. They placed them roughly into the back of the flashing police cruisers. The heavy doors slammed shut, trapping them permanently inside the vehicles. The caterers silently began packing up their expensive equipment, eager to leave the disastrous scene before the police began questioning them. I stood in the cold wind blowing through my former home. I took a deep breath of the crisp winter air. The air felt incredibly clean. I was finally completely free. The flashing red and blue lights painted the snow-covered driveway in sharp, rotating colors. I stood perfectly still on the wooden porch and watched the 2 police officers escort Amanda and Trent out into the brutal winter cold. Trent walked with his head bowed and his shoulders slumped. He was completely defeated by the sudden and absolute destruction of his fabricated corporate facade. His expensive cashmere coat hung awkwardly over his arms as his hands remained secured tightly behind his back. The heavy metal handcuffs glinted sharply under the harsh security lights of the property. Amanda stumbled slightly on the icy steps leading down from the wooden porch. The designer emerald gown worn by Amanda dragged heavily through the dirty brown slush, accumulating near the thick tires of the police cruisers. She turned her head to look back at the house one final time, but I did not offer her a single glance of pity or forgiveness. The heavy metal doors of the patrol vehicles slammed shut with a definitive sound that echoed loudly across the frozen lake. That heavy metallic thud severed the final invisible cord that had tied me to their endless cycle of greed and manipulation. The driveway quickly transformed into a zone of pure corporate efficiency. As the police cruisers slowly pulled away to begin the booking process at the downtown precinct, a convoy of heavy utility vans arrived at the front gate. The regional directors of the hospitality group had wasted absolutely no time securing their newly acquired multi-million-dollar asset. Teams of professional contractors stepped out of the vans wearing heavy winter gear and carrying industrial tools. They moved with strict military precision. Two workers immediately began taking detailed measurements of the shattered patio door, while another team carried large sheets of reinforced plywood to temporarily seal the breach from the freezing wind. I watched a locksmith drill directly into the heavy oak front door, completely destroying the intricate brass handles my late wife and I had carefully installed 20 years ago. The locksmith swiftly removed the old cylinders and installed heavy-duty commercial-grade locks. The house was being systematically stripped of its residential identity and transformed into a fortified corporate fortress. The elite catering company had already packed their remaining warming trays and fled the scene in pure panic. They left behind only the slowly melting ice sculpture of the company logo belonging to Trent in the center of the abandoned living room. Oliver Stanton stood beside me on the porch and placed a warm, reassuring hand on my shoulder. We did not need to exchange any dramatic words or lengthy explanations. The flawlessly executed legal trap had spoken entirely for itself. Oliver nodded silently and walked down the steps toward his idling luxury vehicle to follow the police cruisers back to the city. I turned around to look at the interior of the lake house for the very last time. The expansive space was completely unrecognizable to me. The warmth and love that Mary and I had poured into those walls had been entirely suffocated by years of shallow arrogance and pathetic vanity. The polished hardwood floors where my daughter once took her first steps were now covered in muddy footprints and shattered glass. The grand stone fireplace where we used to hang our handmade Christmas stockings felt incredibly cold and entirely hollow. I searched my heart for any lingering sense of sorrow or any shred of regret, but I found absolutely nothing. The house was no longer a monument to my loving marriage. It was simply a structure of wood and stone that I had successfully traded for my permanent freedom. I pulled the thick collar of my heavy canvas coat up against the biting wind and walked down the porch steps. I did not look back as I approached my own rugged four-wheel drive truck parked near the edge of the property line. I climbed into the driver's seat and started the engine. I sat for a moment, simply listening to the deep, comforting rumble of the heavy motor. The heater blasted warm air across my frozen hands as I shifted the vehicle into gear. I navigated the heavy truck past the corporate utility vans and drove slowly out of the gated community. The tall wrought iron gates closed automatically behind me, sealing the lake house away in the valley of lies forever. I turned my truck onto the steep winding road that led back up into the isolated mountain range. The heavy snowfall had intensified over the last hour, covering the asphalt in a thick, pristine layer of white powder. The powerful headlights cut through the dark storm, illuminating the towering pine trees lining the treacherous path. With every mile I climbed higher into the altitude, I felt another heavy layer of crushing weight lift completely from my tired chest. The physical sensation of leaving the toxicity behind was incredibly powerful. The mountain cabin finally emerged from the darkness like a solitary beacon of absolute safety. The thick snow was piled high against the solid log walls and the heavy wooden shutters protecting the windows. I parked the truck in the small cleared driveway and turned off the engine. The sheer, pristine silence of the mountain environment immediately enveloped me. Down in the valley, my former daughter and her arrogant husband were currently sitting in sterile concrete holding cells waiting to be processed for severe felony charges. They were officially stripped of their expensive clothes, their stolen money, and their fragile social status. Up here on the elevated mountain ridge, there was only the pure sound of the wind moving through the ancient pine branches. I unlocked the heavy cabin door and stepped inside my quiet sanctuary. The interior air was bitter cold, but it was a pure cleansing cold that invigorated my lungs. I took off my winter coat and hung it carefully on the wooden peg near the sturdy door. I walked directly to the large cast-iron stove sitting in the corner of the main living space. I meticulously stacked dry cedar logs inside the dark belly of the stove and placed a handful of dried kindling beneath them. I struck a long wooden match against the stone hearth and watched the bright orange flame catch the rough edges of the dry wood. The fire crackled and hissed instantly, pushing a wave of intense, comforting warmth out into the dark shadows of the room. I stood by the stove for a long, peaceful moment, letting the heat thaw the lingering chill from my aging bones. I walked over to the small rustic kitchen counter and prepared a fresh pot of dark roast coffee. The rich, earthy aroma filled the small cabin, effectively replacing the sterile smells of the corporate gala and the bitter, lingering scent of the expensive bourbon favored by Trent. I poured the steaming black liquid into a heavy ceramic mug and wrapped both of my hands around the warm, comforting surface. I walked over to the large leather armchair, positioned perfectly in front of the roaring fire. I sat down heavily, letting the soft, worn leather absorb the deep physical exhaustion in my muscles. I stared into the dancing orange flames and took a slow, measured sip of the hot coffee. The silence in the room was not empty or lonely in any way. It was a beautiful, rich, and profoundly heavy silence. It was the pure sound of absolute peace. I had lost my only daughter to the corrupting influence of unbridled greed and severe narcissism. I had lost the son-in-law I had desperately tried to support financially and emotionally. But I realized with perfect crystalline clarity that I had not actually lost a family today. The family I thought I was protecting had died the exact moment they viewed my deep personal grief as a lucrative financial opportunity. They were merely strangers who happened to share my blood but possessed absolutely none of my morality or respect. I had successfully excised a toxic parasitic infection from my life before it could completely consume my remaining years. I sat alone in the warm, glowing light of the fire, listening to the fierce winter storm rage outside the sturdy cabin walls. I had successfully reclaimed my dignity, my resources, and my absolute freedom. The complex trap I built was now completely empty, and my life was finally my own again. The profound lesson learned from this ordeal is that enabling toxic behavior under the guise of family loyalty only breeds further destruction. True love requires strict boundaries and accountability. When individuals repeatedly weaponize your grief and generosity for their own selfish gain, they forfeit the right to your protection. George discovered that his absolute silence and calculated patience were far more powerful than engaging in emotional screaming matches. By allowing Trent and Amanda to hang themselves with their own arrogance, he secured his permanent freedom and protected his legacy. Justice is most effective when the guilty orchestrate their own undeniable downfall. What steps would you take to protect your own legacy if your closest family members betrayed your absolute trust?